I think that the films are very different one from another, in part because I taught myself how to make films by making films. In other words, I didn't study film, so I didn't have an idea of what a film should be like until I started making them. And sometimes I joke that each film is about learning how to make the next one differently. The things that I learn while making the film allow me to want to explore something new. So for example, I'm releasing 2 films this year. One of them is about a musician, and it's about a musician because I realized that there was no music in most of my films until very recently, and I was interested in learning about using music in films, and that's one of the reasons why I made a film about a musician. So each film requires a different formal solution to the problems or to the questions I'm asking. I discovered this play by Pirandello a long time ago, maybe 30 years ago. When I was in my 20s, I briefly was involved in theater with a group of friends. We put on plays in English while living in Paris. And I was in the production of a play by Gertrude Stein, a one-act play, and the same evening, 2 friends of mine put on this play by Pirandello. And the early 90s was the AIDS epidemic. And I remember being very touched by the play, very touched by its relationship to this actuality, this epidemic, and thinking, if one day I ever learned how to make a film, then it would be interesting to adapt this into a short film. So this has been in the back of my mind for years, but I didn't ever put this plan into motion until maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Somebody gave me a little bit of money to film something that would be related to climate change. That was sort of the idea. And that's when I went to Holland to film the flower market. I didn't know exactly what I would do with this footage, but I went there for several days with my crew, with Claire Maton and Philippe Welch doing the sound. And then it's put this material on a hard drive somewhere, and I think 6 months later, I just sort of had this idea very randomly while I remember I was sitting in a courtyard in Dakar in Senegal, thinking about something completely different. And this idea of maybe resuscitating this old desire for an adaptation of the Pirandello play and mixing it with these images of the flowers was just sort of an intuition. So I found the text again. I still had the original text from 30 years ago somewhere in a box in my office. And started thinking about this possibility of adapting the play and juxtaposing it with these documentary images. I think the initial desire to juxtapose these two kinds of material was a very intuitive idea, and it was almost like a first-degree joke, In one case, it's the flower in the corner of the man's mouth, and the play by Pirandello is a tumor that is killing him. And in the case of the flowers in the market in Amsterdam, these flowers are in some way metaphorically killing the planet, or the way we grow them in an industrial scale, transport them around the world in a very unsustainable manner. Is a tumor in our ecosystem, and so that was the premise at first. It's just very simply juxtapose these two things, and then when I started thinking more about them, or thinking more about this idea, it just started making a whole lot of sense in many different ways, because you can read the play by Pirandello as a work about observation, looking at the world, and how this observation of the world is one way for this man to stay alive, one way for this man to stay grounded in this life. And the urgency that he has, knowing that he is going to die of this disease, pushes him to wander around the world, wander around the streets of Milano in the original play, watch people work, and then at night tell these stories to a random person that he meets in a bar. And it's almost a theory of cinema. It's almost a theory of why we make films. And then it became very logical to juxtapose these two images. I've worked with Claire Maton on many films over the years, both fictions and documentaries, but never so much of a mix in the same film. And I think in the same way that this film is a proposition about two different approaches to cinema, one of them is direct observation, one of them is, a very constructed, dialogue-based piece of cinema. Claire is extraordinarily gifted at both of these very different things. So being able to sort of show her abilities as a director of photography in these vastly different exercises was also, I think, one of the pleasures of the project. Certainly the methodology of editing fiction is very different in the sense that you have this path, you have a path, and in the case of this particular project, because of the importance of the text itself, the path is fairly well drawn. But it doesn't mean that Claire isn't still doing what she does in documentary, which is looking for the film inside of the material. It's a different way of looking for the film. There is this path that you do follow, but it's hugely pleasant. And I think it was, for me, a lot of fun and very, very interesting to watch Claire work in a different manner, because I've learned most of what I do by working with people and learning from these collaborations. And so working with both Claires has always been hugely instructive for me. And I think this was certainly a new step, and I'm hoping to work more in a fictional manner on the next films with both Claires again. The entire film was shot in a week. So we didn't, or at least essentially the entire film is shot in, I think, 8 days of shooting. So that is not what we call a luxurious amount of time in film. So no, we did not have the luxury of doing, 30 takes on a specific evening. But still, I think there is an urgency in making films quickly with small amounts of money. So it's not something I complain about. It is a reality. If you want to have utter freedom, as a filmmaker, it usually helps to not have a lot of money, because then you have less accountability and you have more freedom. So not having a lot of money means not having a lot of time, but it also creates an energy. So, there were times when we did 6 or 7 takes with Oxmo. It had a lot to do with the complexities of the text itself. But no, we didn't. I think we were able to establish I would say, an environment on the set that was somewhat similar to a documentary process. In other words, we're in a bar, the lighting is fixed, Oxmo knows the text, Dali Ben Salah knows the text, and then the situation unfolds and we are falling back upon something that resembles what we do in documentary, just sort of trying to find the way to film this scene as it's unfolding for us. Well, one of them was a non-professional actor, the other one is a very professional actor. The non-professional actor had the bulk of the text, of course. But I think there was something very fresh and interesting about working with Oxmo Puccino, because it was really about how the text would emerge through him, not necessarily about the craftsmanship of acting. It was about what happens when this text sort of comes through his body and his mind and his gestures and his intonation. He's a musician, he's a poet, he's a performer, but he's a natural. He does things in his own way. And I don't think anybody else could have carried this text in this particular way. And I think the politics of my earlier films are possibly more sort of manifest immediately around the surface because I came from, an interest in politics. That's what brought me to filmmaking, both as a political scientist by training, but also as an activist. But over time, I think the politics remain, but perhaps in this film, you have to understand the question of what makes a film political, perhaps in a somewhat different manner. Claire Atherton, and I think this is something she developed a lot with Chantal Akerman, they were both very interested in the idea that, that a very simple shot of an empty street is a political gesture. Obviously, the shot of a woman washing dishes is a political gesture. So there is, I think, a very political dimension in this film, but it's not on the surface in the same way. And this political dimension has to do with what it means to observe the real today, our relationship to these economic and ecological phenomena that the film is interested in, this metaphor of a disease and how we live the time that we have left to live, and how we transfer these stories to somebody else, is in essence a fundamentally important political question for me. It has to do with our relationship to reality, and I don't think we could be more political than that. I mean, I think especially in this particular moment, the question of the relationship between images and reality is a critical political question at a time when populist demagogues on the right would have us believe there is no reality anymore, that the reality is what is constructed by their discourse and their obsessions and their sort of desire to confuse us with these notions of fake news, et cetera. I think it's an interesting time as a filmmaker to really think about what reality is and how we can, what space we can create inside of a film to deal with this notion of reality. Until this film, the version of the film that I showed inside of an exhibition was the same as the film that I showed inside of a cinema. In other words, it was a single channel film of a certain duration shown on one screen. And what would be different when the work was shown in an exhibition like at MACBA is that I would sometimes sort of bring into the exhibition space or in an adjacent space other works that emanate from this research in the studio, whether it be printed matter, texts, or silk screens, as in the case of the work here at the museum, or collages. And these are sort of parallel works, peripheral works that emerged from the research and that I think raise different questions about the relationship between the story and for example, formal image making. In the case of the Pirandello film, for the very first time with Claire Atherton, we made a 5-screen version of the film that's a lot shorter, that does not include any of the dialogue. So it's a condensed version of the narrative that is then exploded into space on 5 different screens with a lot of footage that is not in the cinema version. And it becomes much more environmental and much more immersive. And this was a very interesting experience for me. I had been skeptical for a long time about sort of spatialized or multiple screen video installations. I think possibly because I think it's a form that's been abused a little bit, and sometimes you enter spaces where there's a multi-screen installation, but it's not entirely clear why it was necessary to have these multiple projections. And but we gave it a try with this work, and possibly because of the material, it became a very exciting project to spatialize it. So I think it's very much project per project. I would say the consideration in my mind at the time will determine whether or not the work will have one formal solution or another. There's no real system in place. Yeah.
Now yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. All right. Thank you very much.